My name is Lucas Carter, and I'm 32 years old. 5 years ago, 3 days before Thanksgiving, my mother called me and said 7 words that quietly erased me from my own family. Don't come home this year. Emily doesn't want drama. No explanation, no apology, just a sentence that slammed the door on 27 years of trying to prove I deserved a place at their table. I remember standing in my tiny Boston studio apartment, staring at the plane ticket I'd already bought to Connecticut. Non-refundable, my suitcase half-packed, a pumpkin candle burning on the windowsill because I'd been trying to get myself into the holiday spirit. Instead, I spent that Thanksgiving alone at a restaurant called Harborview Grill. Around me were families laughing over turkey and wine, kids running between tables, grandparents telling stories loud enough for the entire room to hear. The kind of warm chaos that makes you feel like the world is full of people who belong somewhere. I sat at a small corner table, pretending the empty chair across from me didn't mean anything. I had no idea the strangers at the table beside me were quietly watching. I had no idea that before the night was over, they would invite me to sit with them. And I definitely had no idea that those strangers would eventually become the family I'd been searching for my entire life. 5 years later, they would be standing beside me at the front of a vineyard in Napa Valley, while a wedding announcer introduced them to a room full of guests as the parents of the groom, Richard and Eleanor Morrison. Not my biological parents, my real ones. Meanwhile, across the reception hall, my mother and father stood frozen near the entrance uninvited, unrecognized, watching another couple receive the title that used to belong to them. That was the moment they finally realized something. They hadn't just lost an argument, they had lost their son. But to understand how that happened, you need to hear about the phone call that started everything. Before I take you back to the phone call that started all of this, do me a quick favor. If stories about family drama and finding your own path resonate with you, make sure to like the video and subscribe. And I'm curious, where are you watching from right now? Now let me take you back to the moment everything changed. I remember exactly where I was when my phone rang. November 21st, 3 days before Thanksgiving. I was standing in my tiny studio apartment in Boston, surrounded by half-packed bags and the quiet optimism that always came with the start of the holidays. My suitcase was open on the bed. A pair of boots sat beside it. I'd already printed my boarding pass for the flight to Connecticut. A pumpkin candle burned on the windowsill, filling the room with the kind of warm scent that made you believe everything was going to be okay. Then my phone lit up. I smiled when I answered. "Hey, Mom." I was just about to. "Lucas." Her voice cut through mine. "I need to tell you something." The smile disappeared from my face. That tone never meant anything good. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Is Dad okay?" "Your father's fine." A pause followed, long enough to make my stomach tighten. Then she said it. "Don't come home this year." For a second, I thought I'd heard her wrong. "What?" "Emily doesn't want drama," she continued. "She's pregnant again, and she doesn't need the stress." I stared at the wall across from me. "Drama," I said slowly. "What drama?" "You know exactly what I mean." "No," I said. "I really don't." My hand tightened around the phone. "I haven't even talked to Emily in months." "Exactly," Mom replied sharply. "And let's keep it that way." I blinked. "You're telling me I can't come home for Thanksgiving because we haven't spoken?" "You always make everything about you," she said, her voice hardening. "Emily is pregnant. She needs peace right now." "Mom," I said carefully. "Last year I asked her one question. I asked why I wasn't invited to her baby shower. And that's exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about." "That's not drama," I said. "That's a question." "Lucas," she snapped. "You always do this." Outside my window, snow had started to fall slow, quiet flakes drifting past the streetlight. I watched them as my mother explained why I wasn't welcome in my own home. "I already bought my ticket," I said, finally. "Then get a refund." Her voice carried the finality of a slammed door. "Emily is pregnant," she repeated. "She doesn't need stress. You understand that, right?" The line went dead before I could answer. I stood there holding the phone, listening to the empty silence. And the worst part, I did understand, because this wasn't new. This was just the latest chapter in a story I'd been living my entire life. I sat down on the edge of the bed and stared at the useless plane ticket in my hand. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my father. The phone rang 4 times before he answered. "Hey, kiddo." His voice sounded cautious, like he already knew why I was calling. "Dad," I said. "Did Mom tell you?" A pause. "Yeah," he said quietly. She mentioned it. I rubbed my forehead. And you're okay with this, I asked. You don't think maybe I should be allowed at Thanksgiving with my own family? Another pause. Longer this time. You know how your mother is. Lucas. My jaw tightened. She's just trying to keep the peace. By excluding me. It's not like that. Then what is it like? Dad. Silence filled the line. I could hear the television in the background. A football game. Probably. Tell me. I said. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're all choosing Emily over me again. Nothing. I could almost picture him sitting in his recliner, rubbing his forehead the way he always did when conversations got uncomfortable. Dad. I said finally. Do you want me there? 5 seconds passed. Then 10. When he finally spoke. His voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. I think it's better if you listen to your mother this year. Something inside me went still. Not angry. Not even sad. Just quiet. Okay. I said. Lucas. Don't be like. I said okay. I hung up before he could finish. He didn't call back. And as the winter light faded outside my apartment window, I realized something that would change the rest of my life. My father had just been given a chance to choose me. Just once. And he chose silence instead. I wish I could say that phone call surprised me. But as I sat on the edge of my bed staring at the useless plane ticket in my hand, the memories started lining up in my mind, like scenes from a movie I'd watched too many times. Mom hadn't invented that excuse about keeping the peace. That had always been the rule in our house. Peace meant Emily got what she wanted, and everyone else adjusted. Usually me. The first memory that came back was my 16th birthday. I'd spent weeks planning a small celebration with a few friends from my basketball team. Nothing big, just pizza, cake, and maybe bowling afterward. For once, my parents had actually seemed excited about it. Mom even bought decorations. The morning of my birthday, Emily called home crying. She'd failed her calculus final. I still remember the way Mom's expression changed when she hung up the phone. Your sister's really upset, she said. I already knew where the conversation was going. So, we're going to reschedule tonight. Mom continued. Emily needs us right now. My friends are already coming over. I said quietly. Lucas, don't be selfish. Selfish. The word landed like a weight. She's devastated. Mom said, your sister needs support more than you need a party. Dad stood behind her in the kitchen doorway. He didn't say anything. By the afternoon, my friends had texted one by one, saying the party was canceled. We spent that entire evening at Emily's apartment instead. She cried on the couch while my parents reassured her she was still brilliant. At one point, Mom turned to me and said, almost impatiently, don't be dramatic. Lucas, you can celebrate next weekend. We never did. Another memory surfaced. My college graduation. I'd worked harder than anyone in my family knew. 4 years of part-time jobs, late nights, and cheap ramen dinners. When my name was called and I walked across the stage, I scanned the crowd automatically, looking for them. The seats I'd reserved were empty. I told myself they were just running late. 2 hours later, they finally arrived. Mom hugged me quickly, while Dad carried a small bouquet of flowers that looked like it had been grabbed from a grocery store. What happened? I asked. Emily had a routine prenatal appointment that morning. It ran long. You understand, right? Mom said as if it were obvious. Your sister's baby is more important than a ceremony. More important than me. That was the translation. But I didn't argue. Arguing never worked. Every time I tried growing up, the conversation followed the same script. Why are you so sensitive? Stop making everything about you. Why can't you just be happy for your sister? Eventually, I stopped asking questions. I stopped pushing back. I learned to make myself smaller in ways that were hard to explain. Quieter. Easier. Less inconvenient. I thought that if I became agreeable enough, if I stayed calm, if I didn't complain, if I kept my expectations low enough, maybe one day things would change. Maybe one day they'd look at me the way they looked at Emily. Like I mattered. Like I belonged. But sitting in that silent Boston apartment at 27 years old, holding a plane ticket I'd never use, I finally understood something I'd been avoiding my entire life. There was no version of me small enough to earn a place in that family. And the hardest part of that realization wasn't the anger. It was the clarity. For the first time, I could see the pattern for exactly what it was. I hadn't been excluded just once. I had been slowly erased for years. Thanksgiving morning arrived gray and quiet. I woke up in my Boston apartment to the muffled sound of footsteps above me. My upstairs neighbors were hosting a big family dinner. And even through the ceiling, I could hear the energy building, kids laughing, doors opening and closing. Someone shouting instructions from the kitchen. The smell drifted down through the vents. Stuffing, roasted turkey, the kind of smell that belongs to warm houses and crowded tables. I made a cup of instant coffee and sat by the window, watching snow fall over the empty street below. My phone stayed silent. No calls, no texts, not even a quick happy Thanksgiving. For a while I tried not to think about it. I cleaned the kitchen. I answered a few emails. I pretended the day was just another Thursday. Around noon, I made the mistake of opening Instagram. Emily had posted a photo. The whole family sat around the dining table back in Connecticut. Dad, Emily, her husband Brad, and their 2-year-old son wearing a tiny turkey sweater. Everyone was smiling. The table looked full. Perfect. The caption read, "So grateful for my family. These are the people who matter most." I stared at the picture longer than I should have. Then I zoomed in. 5 place settings. 5 chairs. Not even an empty seat. They hadn't just excluded me. They'd erased me. Like I'd never existed at all. I closed the app and leaned back against the couch, staring at the ceiling. Part of me considered ordering delivery and staying inside all day. That felt like the natural ending to a story like mine. The dramatic son eats takeout alone. The dramatic son sulks in his apartment. The dramatic son proves everyone right. But something in me resisted that idea. If I was going to eat Thanksgiving dinner alone, I wasn't going to hide in the dark while doing it. I grabbed my coat. Boston was cold and quiet that afternoon. Most restaurants closed and the streets nearly empty. A few places still had lights on, though mostly older establishments that kept holiday hours for travelers and people who didn't have anywhere else to go. That's how I found Harborview Grill. It was one of those old Boston restaurants that had probably looked the same for 40 years. Dark wood paneling, brass fixtures, candlelit tables, and the steady hum of conversation echoing off the walls. The moment I stepped inside, warmth hit me like a wave. The smell of roasted turkey and fresh bread filled the air, and everywhere I looked, there were families, large tables crowded with grandparents, parents, children, and cousins, couples sharing quiet dinners, friends raising glasses and laughing like they'd known each other forever. The whole room carried that unmistakable feeling of belonging. The hostess looked at me for a second before asking gently, "Just one tonight?" "Just one." She led me to a small table near the back corner of the restaurant. It was tucked beside the kitchen doors and only a few feet away from a much larger group that had pushed several tables together. 3 generations. From what I could tell, an older couple sat at the head of the table. 2 adult sons and their partners filled the middle seats. Kids ran between chairs, occasionally getting scolded for being too loud. They were passing plates back and forth, interrupting each other, laughing over stories that clearly didn't need explanation. The kind of conversation only families could have. I sat down across from my empty chair and opened the menu, pretended this was normal. My server arrived with a polite smile and a basket of warm bread. "Can I get you the Thanksgiving special?" "Yeah," I said. "That sounds good." A few minutes later, a full plate arrived in front of me. Golden turkey, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, perfectly plated. It looked like something from a magazine. I picked up my fork and realized I couldn't taste any of it. From the corner of my eye, I watched the family beside me. They teased each other, argued about football. One of the kids knocked over a glass of water, and everyone laughed instead of getting angry. And suddenly something shifted in my chest. This is what family is supposed to feel like. Not tension, not walking on eggshells, not silence. Warmth, belonging. For 27 years, I'd been trying to earn a seat at a table where I was never actually wanted. I'd stayed quiet when I should have spoken up, apologized when I hadn't done anything wrong, shrunk myself into smaller and smaller versions of who I really was. And what did that effort buy me? A corner table, a cold meal, and an Instagram photo with no empty chair. If I kept living like that, trying to become someone easier to love, eventually, there wouldn't be anything left of me at all. I stared down at my plate, my jaw tightening, and for the first time all day, the truth finally settled in my mind with uncomfortable clarity. This wasn't about Thanksgiving. It never had been. It was about a family that had decided a long time ago that I was expendable. I exhaled slowly and rubbed my eyes, hoping no one noticed. I didn't want a scene. I didn't want attention. I just wanted to finish dinner and leave quietly. Then I heard a voice beside my table. "Excuse me? Honey?" A Grisand. I looked up. The older woman from the big family table was standing there. Silver hair, kind eyes, and an expression that told me she had noticed everything. "Are you okay?" I froze for a second. The last thing I wanted was attention. "I'm fine," I said automatically. "Just allergies." The woman raised one eyebrow. Not skeptical, just experienced. Allergies don't usually make someone stare at their turkey like it personally betrayed them, she said gently. A short laugh slipped out of me before I could stop it. Was it that obvious? Only to someone who's paying attention. Her voice carried a calm warmth that was impossible to mistake. The kind of tone that didn't demand answers, but somehow made you want to give them anyway. "I'm Eleanor," she said. "Lucas." "Well, Lucas," she said, glancing back toward her table. "No one should eat alone on Thanksgiving." She gestured behind her. "Why don't you come sit with us?" My first instinct was to shake my head. "Oh, I couldn't. I don't want to interrupt your family dinner." "You wouldn't be interrupting," she said easily. "I'm inviting you." Behind her, the older man at the head of the table waved in my direction. "That's my wife being polite," he called out. "What she means is she already decided you're joining us." A younger guy sitting across from him laughed. "He's not exaggerating. When Mom makes a decision, it's basically law." The whole table chuckled. Eleanor smiled back at them before turning to me again. "See," she said, "we're already arguing. You might as well come help balance the chaos." I looked down at my half-eaten dinner, then at the empty chair across from me, then at the table beside us filled with people who somehow had room for one more person. I stood up. "Okay," I said. Eleanor's smile widened like she'd expected that answer all along. "Good choice." The moment I stepped over to their table, people started shifting chairs without hesitation. Someone pulled an extra seat over. Someone else handed me a plate. Before I even sat down, a glass of wine appeared in my hand. "Welcome to the circus," the older man said, extending his hand. "Richard Morrison." I shook it. "Lucas Carter." Richard nodded approvingly. "My wife, Eleanor." "Obviously, that's our son, Daniel." "His wife, Sarah." "Their kids, Emma and Jake, who are currently plotting something suspicious under the table, and that troublemaker over there is our youngest." "Marcus." Marcus leaned back in his chair and raised his glass. "Nice to meet you." "Lucas." "Fair warning. Our dad tells terrible jokes." "Lies," Richard said immediately. "Truth," Sarah replied. Daniel grinned. "Give him 5 minutes." Someone passed me mashed potatoes, then turkey, then stuffing. No one asked if I wanted any of it. They just included me like I'd been there all along. "So what do you do?" Lucas, Daniel asked as he slid the gravy boat toward me. "I'm a graphic designer," I said. "Mostly freelance." "That sounds way more interesting than what I do," Sarah said. "What do you do?" I asked. "Accounting," she said. Marcus groaned dramatically. "Numbers. Endless numbers." Sarah threw a napkin at him. "Someone has to make sure this family doesn't go bankrupt." Laughter rolled around the table again. Easy laughter. The kind that didn't require anyone to perform or defend themselves. Marcus glanced at me from across the table. "You picked a good year to show up," he said. "Dad just discovered internet memes." "That's not true," Richard protested. Marcus pulled out his phone. "You literally asked me yesterday what Doge means." Daniel buried his face in his hands. "Oh my God." Emma, the older of the kids, looked up from her plate. "Grandpa, Doge is ancient internet history." Richard sighed. "Great. Even the 8-year-old is roasting me." I found myself laughing again. Not the polite kind. A real laugh. It surprised me how natural it felt. At some point during dinner, Richard raised his wine glass. "I'd like to propose a toast." The table quieted. "To unexpected guests," he said, glancing at me with a warm smile. Because sometimes they turn out to be exactly who was missing. Everyone raised their glasses. Even me. For a moment I just looked around the table. At the easy conversation. At the way people leaned into each other when they spoke. At the kids arguing over dessert like it was a life or death situation. And something inside my chest loosened in a way I hadn't felt in years. After dinner, while the kids ran laps around the restaurant and the men started debating football scores, Eleanor quietly moved into the chair beside mine. "How are you doing?" she asked softly. "Better," I admitted. "That's good," she said. "But that's not really what I asked." I looked down at my hands. She waited. No pressure. Just patience. "My mom called 3 days ago," I said finally. "Told me not to come home for Thanksgiving." Eleanor's expression didn't change. She simply nodded. "My sister is pregnant," I said. "She didn't want drama." "Drama," Eleanor repeated thoughtfully. That's the word they use when I ask questions they don't like. She studied me for a moment. Can I tell you something I learned during 30 years as a family lawyer? I blinked. You're a lawyer. Retired now, she said. But yes. She took a sip of her wine. In my experience, the people who accuse someone of causing drama are usually the ones creating it. I didn't respond because the words landed too hard. They just need someone else to blame. She finished. Then she looked at me directly. You're not the problem, Lucas. For a second, I couldn't speak. I'd spent most of my life hearing the opposite. Too sensitive, too difficult, too dramatic. You never were, Eleanor added quietly. The conversation around us carried on laughter. Clinking glasses. Kids shouting across the table, but in that moment, everything else faded into the background. Those 4 words hit somewhere deep inside me, a place I hadn't realized was still waiting for someone to say them. Later that night, when the check came, I reached for my wallet. Richard waved me off immediately. Not happening. I can't let you pay for my dinner. I said. You can, he said with a grin. And you will. Marcus nodded. Dad considers it a Thanksgiving tradition. What tradition? I asked. Richard shrugged. Buying dinner for new friends. We gathered our coats and stepped out into the cold Boston night together. Snow was falling harder now, covering the sidewalks in a thin white layer. Before we went our separate ways, Eleanor slipped a small card into my hand. Cream-colored, elegant lettering. Eleanor Morrison, J.D., family law retired. Below that was a phone number and a Brookline address. If you ever need someone to talk to, she said gently, call me. Richard stepped beside her. We do Sunday dinners every week, he added. You're welcome anytime. I started to shake my head. That's really kind. But I don't want to impose. You wouldn't be imposing, Marcus said. He shoved his hands into his coat pockets and smiled. Trust me, Mom doesn't invite people she doesn't mean to keep. Eleanor squeezed my arm lightly. Family isn't just blood. Lucas, she said. It's showing up. I stood there on the sidewalk holding that small business card while snow gathered on my jacket. A woman I'd met 3 hours earlier had just offered me something my own family never had. A place. I didn't know it yet. But that invitation was the beginning of everything. I didn't show up the next Sunday, or the one after that. The invitation from the Morrisons sat on my kitchen counter for almost 2 weeks. Every time I walked past it, I'd pick up Eleanor's business card, stare at the Brookline address, and then put it back down again. It felt strange, too fast, too generous. People didn't just invite strangers into their homes like that. Not in real life. At least, not in the life I was used to. But Eleanor called one evening in early December. Not to pressure me, just to check in. Hi, Lucas, she said when I answered. I just wanted to make sure you're doing all right. That was it. No guilt, no expectations, just kindness. A few days later, I found myself standing outside a large Victorian house in Brookline with a wraparound porch and warm yellow lights glowing through every window. I stood on the front steps for nearly 5 minutes before knocking. The door opened before my hand even dropped. There you are, Eleanor said warmly, like I was someone she'd been expecting all day. She pulled me into a hug before I had time to react. We saved you a seat. Inside, the house smelled like roasted chicken and fresh bread. Voices drifted from the dining room. Laughter. Marcus appeared around the corner when he saw me. Well, look who finally showed up, he said. I was starting to think you'd ghost us. I almost did. I admitted. Marcus grinned. Too late now. That Sunday dinner became the first of many. At first, I kept expecting it to feel temporary. Like eventually someone would realize I didn't really belong there. But week after week, no one treated me like a guest. I was just there. Richard started teaching me chess after dinner. He was ruthless about it. You think 3 moves ahead, he'd say, sliding another piece off the board. That's how life works. I lost every game. Eleanor showed me how to make her famous pie crust from scratch. The secret is cold butter and patience, she explained one afternoon in the kitchen. Daniel's kids started calling me Uncle Lucas without anyone telling them to. The first time Emma said it, I almost corrected her. Then I stopped myself. Marcus and I became close without really trying. We'd sit on the back porch after dinner, talking about work, movies, architecture, or whatever random idea came to mind. Sometimes we argued. Sometimes we stayed up too late drinking cheap beer and debating things that didn't matter. But it was the kind of friendship that didn't feel forced. Natural. Somewhere along the way, something inside me began to relax. I stopped checking my phone to see if my biological family had reached out. Because they hadn't. Not once. No texts. No calls. Not even a Christmas card. And for the first time in my life, I realized something strange. I didn't miss them the way I thought I would. Not because I hated them, but because I had stopped performing for their approval. At the Morrison house, I didn't have to be careful with every word. I didn't have to worry about upsetting someone by existing. I didn't have to shrink myself to keep the peace. I could just be there. One evening in early spring, about 6 months after that first Thanksgiving, I was sitting on the back porch with Eleanor while the rest of the family argued loudly over a football game inside. The garden behind the house was just starting to wake up after winter, small green shoots pushing up through the soil. Eleanor poured tea into 2 mugs and handed one to me. "Have you heard from your parents?" she asked gently. I shook my head. "Do you want to?" I thought about that for a long moment. Sometimes, I admitted, mostly late at night, I stared out at the yard. I'll think about calling my mom, trying to explain things. But then I remember there's nothing to explain. Eleanor waited quietly. "She knows what happened." I continued. "She just doesn't think she did anything wrong." "That's a difficult realization," Eleanor said softly. I rubbed my hands together to warm them. "Everyone always says you should forgive your family. Blood is thicker than water and all that." Eleanor smiled slightly. "I've never believed that." I looked over at her. "In 30 years as a family lawyer," she said, "I helped a lot of people find legal recognition for the families they built, not the ones they were born into." I frowned. "What do you mean?" She studied me for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "Just that sometimes," she said carefully, "family is something you create, not inherit." She sipped her tea and looked back at the garden. "There are ways to make those bonds official, too, if someone ever wanted that." I didn't fully understand what she meant. Not yet, but the idea stayed with me long after that conversation ended, like a seed quietly planted in the back of my mind. It would grow later, at exactly the right moment. Life with the Morrisons slowly stopped feeling like something temporary. It started to feel normal. Sunday dinners became a permanent part of my week. Holidays were spent at their house. Random weeknights sometimes ended with Marcus texting me to stop by because Eleanor had cooked too much food again. Somewhere along the way, another person quietly became part of that rhythm. Clara. She was Eleanor's niece, Daniel's cousin, and someone who had apparently been living in New York for years. Before moving back to Boston around the same time, I started showing up at Sunday dinners. The first time we actually talked was in Eleanor's kitchen, while everyone else argued over football in the living room. Clara was leaning against the counter eating a slice of pie straight from the plate. "You're the mysterious Lucas," she said. "Mysterious?" I asked. "Mom's been talking about you for months," she said with a grin. "Apparently, you beat Uncle Richard at chess once." "That's a lie," I said. "He destroys me every time." "Good," she said. "His ego doesn't need encouragement." She was easy to talk to in the same way. Marcus was no awkwardness. No careful steps around each other. Over time, our conversation started stretching longer. Sometimes we stayed behind after Sunday dinners washing dishes together. Sometimes we walked around the block while the rest of the family cleaned up. It never felt like a big moment when things shifted between us. More like something that had been slowly building, finally becoming obvious. One night Marcus looked at both of us across the table and said, "So, are we all pretending this isn't happening?" Clara threw a napkin at him, but she didn't deny it. 2 years after that first Thanksgiving, Clara and I weren't just part of the same family circle anymore. We were something more. It didn't feel like a beginning. It felt like recognizing something that had already been there. One evening, Marcus asked if I wanted to grab dinner. When we pulled up, I realized exactly where we were. Harborview Grill, the same restaurant where everything had started. "You planned this?" I asked. "Relax," Marcus said with a grin. "Just go inside." Inside, the restaurant looked exactly the same as it had 5 years earlier. Same warm lighting, same dark wood, same quiet hum of conversation. Clara was sitting in a booth near the window. I slid into the seat across from her. "This feels familiar," I said. "That's the point," she replied. Dinner passed in a blur of conversation and nervous energy I couldn't quite explain. Finally, Clara reached across the table and took my hand. "Lucas," she said quietly, "I've been thinking about something for a long time." My heart started beating faster. "You once told me you spent most of your life feeling like you had to earn a place in someone's world," she continued. I nodded slowly. "Well," she said softly, "I want to spend the rest of my life choosing you." She pulled a small velvet box from her coat pocket. The room around us suddenly erupted into applause. I turned and realized half the restaurant was watching. And in the corner booth, Richard, Eleanor, Marcus, and the rest of the Morrisons were already standing with champagne glasses raised. Clara opened the box. "Lucas Carter," she said with a nervous smile. "Will you marry me?" For a moment, I couldn't speak. Then I laughed quietly, and just like that, the life I had accidentally walked into 5 years earlier became something permanent. Wedding planning started almost immediately. Clara dove into it with the kind of enthusiasm that made the whole process feel exciting instead of overwhelming. Venues, guest lists, catering tastings, flower arrangements. Suddenly, my weekends were filled with decisions I'd never imagined making. But there was one detail that kept circling in the back of my mind: the wedding invitations. One evening, Clara and I were sitting at the Morrison house with a stack of sample invitation designs spread across the dining table. Eleanor was helping us compare fonts while Richard pretended not to care, but kept offering opinions anyway. I picked up one of the sample cards and read the line near the bottom: "Parents of the groom." The blank space stared back at me. Robert and Linda Carter. The names felt wrong. They hadn't spoken to me in years. No birthday messages. No calls. No acknowledgement that I even existed. Writing their names there felt like giving them credit for a relationship they had chosen to abandon. I set the card down. Eleanor noticed immediately. "What's troubling you, sweetheart?" I hesitated for a moment before explaining. "I don't know what to write on the invitation. I admit it. I can't put my parents' names there. It doesn't feel honest." The room grew quiet. Richard leaned back in his chair. Clara squeezed my hand under the table. Then Eleanor smiled gently. "Lucas," she said, "do you remember something I mentioned to you once about legal recognition for chosen families?" I nodded slowly. "You said the law sometimes recognizes the families people built." "That's right." She folded her hands on the table. "There's a legal process called adult adoption. It allows a consenting adult to be formally adopted by another family. It creates a legal parent-child relationship, new documentation, new next of kin status. Everything." My heartbeat picked up. "That's actually possible. Very possible," Eleanor said. "I helped many families through it during my career." I looked at her, then at Richard. Two people who had welcomed me into their home without hesitation 5 years earlier. People who had treated me like a son long before any paperwork existed. "Would you," my voice faltered slightly, "would you consider adopting me?" I didn't get to finish the sentence. Eleanor stood and pulled me into a hug. "We've considered you our son since the first Thanksgiving," she said softly. "We were just waiting until you were ready." The legal process took a few months. Court filings, paperwork, one short hearing before a judge who smiled the entire time. And just like that, my name changed. I walked out of that courthouse with a new birth certificate and something I'd never truly had before: a family that had chosen me. From that day forward, I was no longer Lucas Carter. I was Lucas Morrison. The wedding day arrived on a perfect June afternoon in Napa Valley. The vineyard stretched out in every direction, rolling green hills, long rows of grapevines, sunlight spilling across the valley like something out of a postcard. Clara had chosen the venue months earlier, and standing there that morning, I understood why. It felt peaceful, like the beginning of something new. Inside the groom's suite, Marcus was adjusting his tie, while Richard stood by the window pretending he wasn't emotional. "You look good, kid," Richard said after a moment. "Thanks," I replied. But the truth was, my nerves had nothing to do with the ceremony. Clara and I were solid. I had never been more certain about anything in my life. What worried me was something else. 3 months earlier, my biological family had discovered the wedding. It started with a text from my sister Emily. "Did you know Lucas is getting married?" I stared at the message for a long time. Then I blocked the number. After that, my mother called 5 times in a single day. I didn't answer any of them. Finally, a text came through. "Why didn't you tell us we're your family? Call me immediately." I deleted the message. 3 years of silence. 3 years of pretending I didn't exist. And suddenly they remembered they had a son. I had moved past anger long before that moment. Mostly, I just felt tired. That's why we hired security for the wedding. Not out of fear, just preparation. Marcus finished tying his tie and looked at me. "You ready?" I nodded. The ceremony itself was everything I hoped it would be. Eleanor walked Clara down the aisle first, glowing with pride. Richard stood beside me, steady and calm. The vows Clara and I had written together made half the guests cry, and the other half pretend they weren't crying. When we finally said I do, something inside me settled. For the first time in my life, I wasn't chasing a place to belong. I had already found it. The reception moved into a beautiful stone barn overlooking the vineyard. Music filled the room. Guests laughed, clinked glasses, and danced under strings of warm lights. It felt effortless, until the security guard approached me quietly near the bar. "Morrison," he said, "there are two people at the entrance claiming to be your parents." I had been expecting this. Marcus stepped beside me. "You want me to handle it?" I shook my head. I looked across the room at Clara, laughing with Eleanor. "This is my moment," I said. "I'll handle it." I considered my options. I could have them removed immediately. I could have ignored them entirely. But something inside me said no. Let them see. Let them see the life I built without them. Let them in. I told the guard. But seat them in the back. A few minutes later, I spotted them. Linda and Robert Carter stood near the far wall of the reception hall, looking uncertain and out of place among the 100 guests celebrating my wedding. They scanned the room, confused. They hadn't noticed the program yet, or the name printed on it. Perfect timing. The master of ceremonies stepped up to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "if I could have your attention for just a moment." The room quieted. Glasses paused midair. "Before we continue the celebration, I'd like to introduce two very special people." Across the room, my mother straightened immediately. I could almost see the expectation in her posture. "Please join me in welcoming." He paused dramatically. "The parents of the groom." Linda lifted her chin. She looked ready to accept the recognition she believed belonged to her. "Richard and Eleanor Morrison." The room erupted in applause. Richard and Eleanor stood from the head table, smiling warmly as guests cheered and raised their glasses. Cameras flashed. Laughter filled the room. Across the reception hall, my mother's face went pale. I watched realization spread across her expression in slow motion. Confusion, disbelief, then understanding. She grabbed my father's arm. "What did he just say?" Robert looked just as stunned. Meanwhile, around them, guests continued clapping and congratulating the couple they assumed had raised the groom. To everyone in that room, Richard and Eleanor Morrison were exactly what they appeared to be. My parents. Linda pushed through the crowd toward me. Her voice dropped to a sharp whisper when she reached me. "What is going on?" I met her eyes calmly. "My legal parents. I was adopted 3 years ago." Her mouth opened slightly. "You can't just replace us." I didn't raise my voice. "You replaced me first." "That's not true. You told me not to come home," I said evenly. "You chose Emily." Every single time. Guests nearby had started noticing the confrontation. Conversations faded. Linda's voice trembled with anger. "I'm still your mother." "Not legally," I replied, "and not emotionally." Marcus moved quietly to my side. The room had gone almost completely silent. Then my father spoke. For the first time in decades. "Lucas." His voice cracked. "I'm sorry." I turned toward him slowly. Robert Carter looked older than I remembered. Smaller somehow. "I should have done better." He continued quietly. "I knew how your mother treated you. I knew how things were with Emily." His voice broke. I just stood there. A tear slid down his face. I let it happen. Linda grabbed his arm. "Robert, stop." He shook her off. "You were my son," he said to me, "and I failed you." For a moment, something painful twisted in my chest. Not forgiveness, just recognition. "I know you're sorry," I said gently, "but sorry doesn't undo the years." Eleanor appeared beside me, her hand resting lightly on my arm. Linda glared at her. "You stole my son." Richard stepped forward then. "Steady. We didn't steal anything," he said. His voice carried across the silent room. 5 years ago, your son was sitting alone in a restaurant on Thanksgiving because his own family told him he wasn't welcome. He looked directly at Linda. "My wife invited him to our table." Richard's voice grew firmer. "We didn't steal your son." He paused. "You gave him away." Linda flinched. Security moved closer. Richard placed a hand on my shoulder. "Lucas is a Morrison now," he said quietly, "and Morrisons protect their own." He nodded to the guards. "Please escort these people out." Before they could move, I stepped forward. Everyone froze. I looked at my biological parents. "I don't hate you," I said calmly. Linda blinked in surprise. "I've made peace with who you are." I continued. "You're not villains. You're just people who couldn't love me the way I needed to be loved." Robert lowered his head. But I've also made peace with who I am. I stood straighter. I'm someone who deserves to be chosen. I gestured toward the Morrisons. You didn't choose me. They did. Security guided my parents toward the exit, and as they disappeared through the doors, the room slowly filled with applause. Not for the drama, for the truth, for the life I had chosen to build. The rest of the wedding went exactly the way it was supposed to. Once my biological parents were escorted out, the tension in the room slowly dissolved. Music came back. Conversations restarted. Someone popped another bottle of champagne, and the dance floor filled again. Marcus dragged me into the center of the floor. "All right," he said, clapping his hands. "Emotional family drama is officially over. Back to celebrating." Clara laughed and pulled me into a slow spin beneath the string lights. For the next few hours, I allowed myself to forget everything else. We danced. We cut the cake. Richard gave a speech that somehow made half the room cry and the other half laugh. Eleanor hugged Clara so tightly during the mother of the groom dance that the photographer had to gently remind them people were waiting. And for the first time in my life, I experienced a moment that felt completely uncomplicated. The next morning, though, my phone started lighting up. Texts from cousins I barely remembered. Messages from distant relatives who suddenly had strong opinions. How could you do that to your mother? Family is family, no matter what. You embarrassed your father in front of everyone. I deleted them one by one. No response. No explanation. 3 decades of silence had taught me something important. You can't argue someone into understanding a truth they refuse to see. Later that afternoon, a message appeared from someone unexpected. Aunt Patricia, my dad's younger sister. We hadn't spoken in years. I opened the text. "Lucas, I heard what happened. I want you to know something. I'm proud of you." I stared at the screen for a long moment. "Your mother and Emily always treated you unfairly," she continued. "I tried to say something once. Your mother stopped speaking to me for a year, but you deserved better. You always did." My chest tightened slightly. I typed back one sentence. "Thank you. That means more than you know." A few days later, my sister, Emily, sent a handwritten letter. I almost threw it away without opening it. But curiosity won. The letter was exactly what I expected. She said Mom was devastated. She said Dad hadn't been the same since the wedding. She said family was complicated. And then, almost casually, she wrote the sentence that confirmed everything had stayed exactly the same. "You always made things harder than they needed to be." I folded the letter and put it in a drawer. Marcus came home a little later and found me in the kitchen. "What did she say?" he asked. "Nothing new," I replied. "She still thinks I'm the problem. Does that bother you?" I thought about it for a moment. "No," I said, "because it's not my job to make her understand." And for the first time in my life, that answer felt completely true. 1 year later, life looked very different. Clara and I bought a small house just outside Boston, 20 minutes from the Morrison house, close enough for Sunday dinners, far enough for our own quiet space. Work was going well. Marcus was thriving at his architecture firm, and Clara and I had news that made Eleanor cry immediately when we told her. We were having a baby. One afternoon, Eleanor and I stood together in the nursery, painting the walls a soft shade of green. "Have you picked a name yet?" she asked. "Emily," I said. She looked surprised. I smiled slightly, but not after my sister. "Emily Grace Morrison." Eleanor wiped her eyes. "That's beautiful. The Morrison part is the important one," I said. "I want our daughter to carry the name of the family that chose her father." Eleanor hugged me tightly. "You chose us too," she said, "and that matters just as much." 5 years after the night, I sat alone in Harborview Grill. I found myself sitting at the head of a very different Thanksgiving table. The Morrison house was loud, kids running everywhere, Marcus arguing about football, Richard pretending he wasn't sneaking extra pie, Emily, our daughter now 6 months old, being passed from one set of arms to another like the most precious thing in the world. Eleanor clapped her hands. "Before we eat, we need a toast." She looked at me. "Lucas." I stood, holding my daughter carefully in my arms. 5 years earlier, I had believed something about myself that wasn't true. I believed I was too difficult, too sensitive, too dramatic, too much. I used to think there was something wrong with me. I said quietly that if I just worked harder, if I became easier to love, eventually, my family would choose me. I looked around the table, at Richard, at Eleanor, at Marcus, at Clara smiling beside me. But then a stranger walked up to my table on Thanksgiving and said something that changed my life. I raised my glass. She said no one should eat alone on this day. Richard wiped his eyes. Eleanor was already crying. So, here's my toast. I continued. To family. Not the one we're born into. The one we build. The one that chooses us back. Glasses clinked. Emily gurgled happily in my arms. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't wondering if I belonged somewhere. I already knew. I was home.